This is the only time he'll ever feel calm listening to the album Deathconsciousness. The song is a quick one before the eternal worm devours Connecticut. Definitely a memorable name, and definitely a memorable song. I love this song. It's delicate yet foreboding, warm yet haunting. It's ethereal. You'd think it would be comfortable, except there's something hanging in its air. Dread. Or rather, a kind of acceptance. Maybe that's what makes it comforting in the particular way that it is. And though it sounds very different from the rest of the songs here, that feeling is what this album is all about. Deathconsciousness consistently finds ways to unnerve, startle, and numb its listeners with unsettling quiet moments and its epic walls of sound. It's not just shock value, this is one of the bleakest works of music I've ever listened to, and just from the name of the album, I think you can get an idea of what the band Have a Nice Life conveys in it. The duo effort from Dan Barrett and Tim Bakuga, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, released in 2008. At the time, it really went under the radar, but it soon became a cult classic. I came across it when it was recommended on Spotify, initially with the track Blood Hell. As you can see from the live video, this one's an anthem. The lyrics evoke desperation that matches the trudging, persistent bass and drums. The singing soars as he says, and what this album does really well is merging its philosophical ideas with the emotions it brings out musically. First, let's discuss the ideas. One of the cool things about Deathconsciousness is that if you buy the album, it comes with a booklet. It details the dark and forgotten history of the Antiochean cult, apparently. The foreword makes it seem like it was written by a professor of religious history at UMass Amherst that the band had contacted. But as many others who have talked about the album have said as well, there's not really much historical fact to all this. Wikipedia cites Dan Barrett himself as the author of the booklet. The figure that the book talks about is... the real information about him is much more limited than what is discussed here. So in looking at this booklet, it's even more clear that it's meant as a thematic guide or parallel to the music. I'm actually going to be referencing another video that dives super deep into the philosophy of the album by Duncan Clark. Please go check out that video. He does a great overview of what the booklet and the album discusses. The preface of the book is, "This is Deathconsciousness, and it begs the question, what is the point?" So the story is essentially about a man named Antiochus in middle-aged Rome. He arrives in Rome only to be cast out, and when he returns 25 years later, he begins preaching his philosophy, starting a minor religion/violent cult. The book explains that Antiochus believed that people are inherently clinging to rationality. They long for it, because it represents life. There's also an inherent fear of death. They recoil from death, ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, desperately hold on to their sense of reason and fairness in an attempt to convince themselves that negation won't affect them and the things that they create, that they themselves will not be negated by the universe. Antiochus being punished led to a wave of random murders in Rome by his followers, and after the brutal crackdown by the Romans, Antiochus was eventually caught and burned at the stake. Now, here are some of Clark's takeaways from the story that I wanted to share. 1. The inevitability of death is something that's reinforced throughout the story. 2. Antiochus believed that the power of negation, the power to destroy, as discussed earlier, is more powerful than the power of life, and therefore everything will by nature collapse in on itself eventually, and all will cease to exist. Clark adds this with another point from Ray Brassier, saying that our ability to enjoy something is temporary and something we can grow numb to, while we can always be susceptible to suffering. It leads to the third takeaway. We are already dead because of our inevitable mortality. Okay, as Clark also points out, this is all incredibly dark, like Jesus Christ. There's an interview from Scene Point Blank with Have a Nice Life that I think contextualizes the book and its ideas. When asked about how the concept for the album came about, Dan said, "Deathconsciousness is very closely tied to what was going on in my life at the time of its recording. It emerged naturally from my writing. It's the opposite of the predominant cultural attitude towards death in the West, namely that we should just pretend it doesn't exist. It does exist, and for a long time it was all I could think about. That naturally influenced the music, lyrics, even the packaging. There's the notion of actively opposing the natural view on things with Have a Nice Life, which you could also see in the book with Antiocheanism. There's a skepticism in what's always being peddled. Screen Point Blank also asked, "Do you think that the predominant Western attitudes towards death are psychologically unhealthy?" Tim said, "People get by." He also said for another question, "Humans have a lot of anxiety over the prospect of ceasing to be. Having the ability to think I isn't necessarily balanced with not I." Dan adds, "Actually, I think the ability to think I precludes truly understanding not I. It seems impossible to conceive of a state in which we do not exist to conceive it. We can get close, but it's more emotional than intellectual. That's what the music's for." Being able to understand what not I really means is just, it's so difficult to even conceive is what Dan seems to be saying. And with him saying that's what the music's for, with that said, let's get to what's so cool about the album is how it manages to be both emotionally resonant as well as enjoyable to listen to. It's not a chore by any means. Multiple songs convey the atmosphere of a hostile apocalyptic plane. The foreboding deep strings in Hunter feel like the announcement of a coming storm. I was reminded of the soundtrack of Terminator. Telephony continues those Terminator vibes with its high synth and heavy echo drums, creating a palpable sense of danger. The Terminator parallel is interesting to me because of the time machine reference in the lyrics. The machine that snaps all of time in half. I can break its back. I can break its back. I can build a door and I can travel through. There's the sense that this anxiety, that darkness is ever present, omniscient, and the Antiochean book. Its instrumentation choice gives an oppressive sense of despair, its droning guitars dragging us against the concrete ground. That relentless despair is unsettling to me. There's an interesting review from Medium.com that says this about the album. When you have depression, all your other emotions get mashed into a sort of detached empathy. The most powerful emotions barely even register as a blip. Your brain endlessly pummels at you until all you feel is nothing. Deathconsciousness perfectly captures that feeling, and somehow manages to find beauty in it. This is completely apt. The heavy guitars of the song I Don't Love are at times difficult to distinguish, and they at first almost completely drown out the emotional vocals. The finale, Earth Mover, is also appropriately named, beginning with a kind of beautiful anthemic trudging, and as if pushed to the brink of exhaustion, and finally, it lets go. It kind of scares me. Not just because it's shocking. It's just that when its conclusion is so powerfully dark, I guess I don't exactly know how to transition here, so... So I really like this movie, and I think there are some commonalities in what it talks about and what Deathconsciousness talks about. I'll keep plot details vague, but the album's concern with being present and aware of death is something that the movie also tackles. The main character's burdens in life has brought her to the point of this acceptance and embrace of death in the void, something the antagonist is also very much preoccupied with. When all your problems seem insurmountable, maybe not even just objectively, but in the confines of your mind, it can just get to the point where you say yourself,
nothing matters. Oh, Joy. You don't believe that? Feels nice, doesn't it? If nothing matters, then all the pain and guilt you feel for making nothing of your life goes away.
The ultimate goal of the antagonist is to let go, be consumed by the bagel, because the frustration won't end. I think that sentiment is something we can all relate to at one point or the other. For me, I look at the last 3 years and I see stagnation. In 2021, I made a high school health class PSA about sleep deprivation with a friend, and I acted out the part of someone who's stuck in the cycle of sleep deprivation. In that story, I tried overcompensating for procrastination by staying up late. Last semester, I made a silent short film for a class that also involved me being stuck in a cycle of procrastination. In that story, I tried overcompensating for procrastinating by staying up late, only to oversleep egregiously. This semester, I find myself up later and later and sleeping in again and again. In this story, I try overcompensating for procrastination and staying up late, only to ruin my sleep schedule. I guess this is where things converge just a little. And it begs the question, what is the point? Part of the movie is the main character becoming aware of all the many realities, and ultimately, that reality is of your own making. The material is an illusion and is of no consequence ultimately. It's something you have to overcome. You have to overcome that illusion on the path to enlightenment. Now that and this movie aren't saying that nothing matters and all we can do is just resign ourselves, but rather it's just saying because nothing matters, we can take control of what should matter to us, and that's compassion. I say all this at the big risk of being excessively overwrought. I don't want to claim some big understanding of this absolutely bonkers movie or anything else. It's just that I look at everything everywhere all at once, and I see a genuine reckoning with the depths of despair and nihilism, and it then rips that nihilism to shreds with the simple truth. I went on this overlong tangent just because of how different this movie and the album Deathconsciousness reckon with that looming presence of nothingness. And it's because I'm so moved by the movie's handling of it that I find the album so disconcerting at times. With depressing art, I often see it as a tool to call out some sort of injustice or other bad situation. Here, it really is just focusing on those emotions entirely. At one point, I asked what the point of making art so hopeless like this is. But then, in the process of making this video, I came across a live performance of Have a Nice Life, and I think my question was answered. You see the passion in Dan Barrett's eyes. It's not just frustration, but also catharsis. In a Reddit AMA with Dan Barrett, someone asked, essentially they asked, how do you work on your art through depression? Sometimes it's so difficult to even get out of bed, and writing seems impossible. How do you motivate yourself? Part of his response was, I tend to write most when I'm coming out of those periods already. Feelings are still there, but I can be productive. And the act of doing it is helpful as well. I can definitely see that. Duncan Clark's video points out that the anger expressed at time and telephony could be related to Dan Barrett dealing with the passing of his father, and that event had influenced the process of making the album. Being able to look back and say something about it is what this album seems to be about. It's ironic that something so bleak can also be just as cathartic, not just in terms of making it, but if you look at how many people who seem to have connected to this album as a listener on a very personal level. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And the album might not just be about despair. Don't get me wrong, the band presents something extremely grim, but it's something that asks us to reckon with our own mortality rather than just always being afraid of it. You can take that in the way that you would like.